Critics often argue that we cannot trust the New Testament because we don't possess the original copies, that is, the very papyrus pages that Paul, Luke, or John would have written on when they wrote their texts. But is that really a valid objection? To begin, we must first cover some context behind the debate between Christians and their critics on the New Testament and textual criticism. Christians will usually point to the fact that the manuscript tradition of the biblical text shows a remarkable consistency of transmission. That is, you do not see corruption such that the biblical text is substantially altered or transformed in a way that our doctrine is actually affected. That is not to say that there aren't any variants in the manuscript tradition, but it is to say that none of those variants are both substantial and alter our doctrine overall. Thus, 0% of the variants substantially alter the text in terms of doctrine, which gives us confidence in the textual security of the biblical text. In response, however, some critics of Christianity will say that we can't know what the text said because we don't have the autographs, and or that there's some gap between our earliest manuscripts and the supposed autographs. An autograph of a text would be the exact thing that the original writer of a text would have written on. For example, the papyrus that Matthew himself wrote the Gospel of Matthew on would be an autograph. But if you were to take a new papyrus and copy the initial text from the autograph to this new papyrus, that new papyrus would be a manuscript which is derived from the autograph. So the objection is basically that we do not have the exact papyrus that, for example, the original copy of Matthew was written on. However, the lack of direct access to the autographs is not an issue, as we can still be confident that we know what the autographs look like through our manuscripts, even if scribes are still fallible. This is because prima facie, manuscripts of any text are reliable and not corrupted, and thus accurately represent the autographs to a certain degree. This is usually regardless of the date of the manuscripts. For example, if we found a manuscript of a text and the manuscript was from the 9th century but the actual text itself was from the 4th, we would assume that the manuscript is not corrupted until proven otherwise. This is the case even if the manuscript is the only manuscript of that text in existence that we possess. It is simply not our burden to prove that a manuscript is not corrupted, but rather we assume that it is textually reliable until proven otherwise. This is because the manuscript is copied from older manuscripts or from the autograph itself. The job of the scribe was to maintain consistency between what the autograph said and what their manuscript said. Scribes even engaged in their own textual criticism to ensure that what they gave was faithful to the initial autograph. The manuscripts thus trace back to some autograph, as scribes have copied them either from the autograph directly or from other manuscripts that trace their origin back to the autograph. Furthermore, in the case of the New Testament, the widespread usage of the text in multiple regions and ideological groups would make it impossible for any substantial corruption. For example, even if a Gnostic sect changed the text in Spain, we wouldn't expect an Orthodox group in the Levant to also just accept their reading, especially given that a novel addition/subtraction would not be well attested in the manuscript tradition. Thus, when we do textual criticism, we give the manuscripts the benefit of the doubt usually. This is true in history as a whole. To demonstrate this, some concrete examples of where we give manuscripts the benefit of the doubt despite their supposedly late date can be given. Firstly, there's Tacitus, who wrote the Annals around 100 AD. To reconstruct the Annals, text critics use a small amount of manuscripts from the Middle Ages. Specifically, we have 2 manuscripts from a library in Florence. One of these manuscripts is from the 9th century, and the other is from the 11th century. Despite this, we still use these manuscripts to reconstruct the text of Tacitus' The Annals, and then we use that to make conclusions about history. Furthermore, we still date the text itself well before the earliest manuscripts. This is because we prima facie trust the scribes and the manuscript tradition to accurately preserve the text throughout time. If we do not employ this principle, all of history would be gone because for basically all texts, we did not possess any autographs. Let us also note that Tacitus' The Annals is regarded as many as the greatest historical narrative to survive from ancient Rome. Secondly, Livy, a Roman author and historian, wrote around 30 BC, but the earliest manuscripts for his Annals of the Roman people come from around the 4th century. Despite this, scholars still use these manuscripts to reconstruct his text. Thirdly, we have Julius Caesar, who was a Roman dictator who wrote his Gallic Wars around the 60s BC. The earliest manuscripts we have, however, are from the 9th century AD. Despite this, we still use these manuscripts to reconstruct the text of Julius Caesar, and then we use that text to make conclusions about history. Fourthly, Thucydides wrote the Peloponnesian War around 460 BC, and yet we reconstruct the text using 10th century manuscripts. Now, although there exist earlier manuscripts, the 10th century manuscripts are the ones primarily used, as the earlier ones are just fragments. Fifthly, Pliny the Younger wrote between 97 to 112 AD. There are 3 separate manuscript traditions for reconstructing the text: 9-book, 10-book, and 8-book. 9 Book is represented in 2 9th century manuscripts. 10 Book actually has 0 manuscripts, but only has printed editions which exist and are used, and the 8 Book tradition has no surviving complete manuscripts. Despite this, we still use these late manuscripts to reconstruct the text, and we use the text to derive historical conclusions. Finally, Josephus wrote around the late 1st century. To reconstruct the text of his Judean War, there are 7 manuscripts which stand out for their early date and intrinsic value, and are principal witnesses. However, these principal witnesses to reconstruct Josephus are from the 11th century, and although there are obviously some earlier witnesses, these are fragments and not the principal manuscripts for reconstruction. Despite the late dates of the manuscripts, however, we still use these manuscripts to reconstruct the text of Josephus, even if we can't have 100% certainty that the current text we have is reliable. This doesn't just apply to the Judean War, as the most important manuscripts for reconstructing the text of Josephus's Judean antiquities are from the 9th to 14th century. Similarly, Josephus's life is preserved in 6 principal manuscripts which range in date from the 9th to 14th century. In all these cases, we do not just assume that a manuscript is corrupted just because it is far removed from the autograph. Rather, the burden of proof would be upon, say, someone claiming that the scribes later interpolated the text of Tacitus. Furthermore, the point is not that there is a 100% probability that the reconstructed text is the same as the autograph. Rather, we simply trust it prima facie because we trust scribes prima facie. It should be noted that our New Testament manuscripts, in contrast, are much closer to the original composition of their books, and thus we are in a better position epistemically to know what the autograph said. Bock and Wallace conclude that whatever doubts we cast on the text of the New Testament must be cast 100-fold on virtually any other ancient book. The New Testament manuscripts stand closer to the original and are more plentiful than probably any other ancient literature of that era. Thus, we may conclude that the objection based on us not possessing the autographs is a failure. The burden of proof is upon the one who posits that the scribes failed to preserve the text and the meaning of the autographs in their copies.